I'm here to show you everything you need to know about how to build Corsair's AIR 5400 case. I'm going to show you how to wire and set everything up in this build, including how to do a push-pull radiator, so you can have up to 6 fans on the rad if you want. Some really good temperatures, which I'll show in the review, but I was getting around 40 degrees C with a 9800X3D CPU, which is pretty impressive. I'm going to show you all the little details you need to know about the build process, starting with stripping the case down, talking about the little highlights and the wiring details and the little things that I discovered along the way, including how to take it apart and then how to put it back again, which was a little bit problematic in some ways. So I'll get to that later on. And I'll leave timestamps down below so you can jump to relevant points in the video or skip things that you already know. Now, this is the RS version of the case, which comes with reverse blade fans mounted on the bottom and wired up, ready to go. But there's also an IQ Link version of the case with LX fans, which I'll do a separate guide on. But essentially, the logic for the build is basically the same sort of thing. Now, most of the panels come off fairly easily. That top panel pulls away, as you can see, and is nice and solid and well built there, nicely constructed. And then the doors will open up with relative ease as well. So you've got 2 glass doors which open up on either side. You will notice that they both swing around quite a bit though, so you'll want to remove those for the build process so they don't get damaged or broken, but it will make it convenient if you do need to get inside your PC at some point in the future. Now, in order to do it, there are screws, so there's a little screw on the top left, for example, of the main door. If you just unscrew that, you can then lift the glass panel out and take it out of the way. So this panel is really easy to remove. You just make sure you save that screw and don't lose it, because you'll need it to re-secure it later on. Showing this from a different angle just so you can see it. So there's a couple of pins on one side that it slots back into when you replace that, and then a little screw goes in the top of that to tighten it up and secure it. But this is good because it means that you can get this out of the way so it doesn't get damaged during the build. The other panel is a bit more complicated, so that comes out, but in order to remove it, you need to do a few other things first, one of which is popping off this airflow panel from the front here, which you can remove to access the radiator tray where we'll be installing fans in the radiator later on. But doing that also gives you access to another thing that I'll show in a second. Now, the rear door also swings open with relative ease, and just like the front glass panel, this is also held in place with a screw, so it is worth taking that off. Makes life a little bit easier. So if you see this from the rear of the case, you can see it swings all the way around. You can either close it during the build or just remove it entirely. I found it easier to take it off, so just unscrew that, keep that screw so you don't lose it, because you'll need that again later on as well, and then take the door off with the same sort of logic, pop it open, and then just lift it up, and it will come off with the couple of pins back there, and you can get easy access to the case that way. Obviously, most of the cables are already cable tied, Velcro tied at the rear, and fairly neat, and I'll show you where all those cables plug in a little while. Now, once that front panel's off, you'll see that we can now take this glass panel off, but it is a little bit tricky to do so. First of all, you need to remove 2 screws from the top, 2 screws from the bottom, and then basically slide a pin out from inside here. Now, I used some tweezers for this because it was pretty tricky to do, but you'll find that that plate is held in place behind those screws. Remove the screws, the plate comes out, then you can take the pin out. Now, this is pretty easy at the beginning, but when it comes to putting this back later on, it is pretty tricky. So if you can do it without removing this glass panel, you might want to consider that. Just be very careful during the build when you do it, and you'll see what I mean later on when we get to the end of the video. But as you can see, with those screws removed, there's just a plate behind there that comes out when you can take that out, and that's what's holding the pin in place. So you need to remove that first in order to remove the pin, which then means you can remove the door. You need to reverse this procedure in order to then be able to put the door back on and secure it in the future. A little bit tricky, a little bit fiddly, definitely not as easy as the other ones. But once you've done that, you can then take this glass panel out by just simply turning it like this and pulling it out. You'll see it's hooked in place. We've got these hooks basically go through, and that's how the pins would then hold it. But we can then remove this so it doesn't get damaged, which is obviously beneficial. Inside the case, we also have an additional panel, which is this plastic one with a furry top, which is nice for hiding the cables. And then obviously the cable management tray as well, which has Velcro ties all the way down, holding the various cables in place and securing those. And you can use that to neaten things up in there as well. Multiple different points in there for tying the cables down and neatening them in. And we have a variety of cables here, which I'll show you how to plug in. Front panel, HD audio, USB 3 and USB 3.2, as well as 2 connectors for those bottom fans, 5-volt RGB connection and chassis fan header or system fan header, and then a male RGB connector that's coming from the fans at the bottom right here. Pay attention to that, because if you're using more RS fans in the case, you can daisy chain the RGB up by using that, and I'll show you that in a minute. The accessories box includes a number of different things we want to quickly look at, one of which is a dust filter for the front of the case that you can use with the fan tray, and then you have additional things, including all the screws that you'll need. With these, I'll show you which screws are used for what and where in a minute. So we'll go through all of those different things and show you what to do. Before going any further though, it's worth prepping your motherboard. So I'm using an X870 Aorus Elite Wi-Fi 7 here, and also a Nautilus 360 RS LCD. So with these things, worth prepping the motherboard beforehand to receive the pump, and also to set it up so it's ready to install in a little while. Now obviously other coolers are available, but I'm using this Corsair one, which, as I've shown, gets really good temperatures in this setup. It's also pretty straightforward to install with just a couple of cables coming out of the pump head. You have different things depending on whether you're doing AMD or an Intel build. Obviously I'm sticking to AMD for this. You also have enough screws for the push-pull setup as well, which will be important for this in a little while. And standard RS fans, which you could use instead of what I'm going to do. So you could just install those on the Radiator, and I'll talk more about how you do that later on. But instead of that, I'm using 2 sets of RS120 ARGB fans on either side of the Radiator, so that we can do this, where you can have 6 fans on it, both facing the same direction, pulling loads of air through the front of the case, and then exhausting using that smart system on this case, which is that venting, so all the hot air goes out the back and doesn't go into the system. Before installing anything in the case, I'd recommend prepping your motherboard first of all. So that's what I'm going to start with, installing the CPU on there. So lift the little lever and the latch there to expose the pins below, and gently seat your CPU into the socket as I'm doing here. You'll see it slots in place nicely there with a little gold arrow pointing up to the top left. And then you just need to put the hatchback down, reseat that lever to secure it. Take care when doing that so you don't damage any of the pins in the process. Next, we want to remove these standard brackets above and below the CPU socket. For this all-in-one cooler, we're looking to replace the standard clips that come pre-installed on the motherboard. This is a pretty standard practice across a lot of different all-in-one coolers for AM5 platform. You're basically removing these clips and then replacing it with separate standoffs or brackets. In this case, we have these ones which have a grey plastic bottom to them, and they screw into the screw holes surrounding the socket. There are 4 of those, so you just need to screw those down and make sure they're tightened up nicely. The idea here is that the motherboard will then be able to receive the CPU cooler once the motherboard's installed into the case and you're ready to do that. Next up is the RAM. So I'm using 2 sticks of Corsair Vengeance RGB DDR5 RAM in this build and in this motherboard. If you're using 2 sticks, you need to make sure you use the 2nd slot and the 4th slot on the motherboard. So first of all, release the little latches that you can see there, and then insert the RAM into the socket. Take care with this because the RAM will only go in one way round. You'll see that the barcode faces towards the left with this RAM, for example, and you can't put it in the other way around. If you try and force it, you'll break it. Now you could put 4 sticks of RAM in there potentially, but I'm using a Vengeance lighting enhancement kit, which happens to look like RAM, but it's just dummy RAM for RGB lighting. This basically has the same installation process as RAM, basically slotting into those other 2 slots, but it then allows you to have some pretty cool RGB lighting filling up the motherboard and also making sure you haven't got any gaps there. So it's a nice little additional purchase. It doesn't cost a lot, although obviously it doesn't boost the RAM in the system. Make sure they click into place when you push them in, and you'll find that they're fully seated there. Next up is the NVMe SSD. I'm using a Crucial P310 for this. This is an SSD that will allow you to have easy storage on your system and very easy to install. Usually the motherboard will have a removable heatsink like this, which is held in place with a clip or a screw. So you just need to remove that first of all. Then line up the NVMe drive with the socket. Notice there's a little plastic notch in the socket there, and then push it into place and then seat it back down with a little Q latch on the left-hand side there to secure it. Some motherboards require a little screw in order to do that. Then remove the sticker from the thermal pad and then seat the heat shield back on, re-securing the Q latch there to hold it in place. Then the motherboard's ready to be installed in the case. So we just need to line it up with the back panel there and with the standoffs already pre-installed in the case. This is an ATX motherboard, so it will fit there. And then you just need these motherboard screws to secure it at multiple points. You should find that there are 3 screw holes across the middle, across the top, and across the bottom. So you just need to secure each of those points, taking your time to make sure they're tightened up nicely and secured. Now, the interesting thing about this motherboard is that one of those holes is actually hidden below that heat shield on the NVMe drive that I just put in place. So I actually had to take that off again in order to access that. You can see it here, so we can then secure that and then put the heat shield back on afterwards and pop that down. So that's the motherboard secured and in place and ready for the cooler, and you can see it's much easier to do outside the build. Now I'm going to show you how to connect the case cables to the motherboard and where they plug in. So these are obviously tied at the rear currently with those Velcro ties and held in place there, apart from the fan cables which are laying across the bottom of the case. Now these are the 5-volt RGB connection and system fan power connectors for those 3 reverse blade fans at the bottom. So if we just pop them through the bottom of the case at the rear so that we can access them at the front, and then we can plug those in and sort those out. So we've got 2 connectors we need to deal with, pretty straightforward. Luckily, it's 3 fans, 2 connectors, pretty easy to deal with. So one needs to plug into a fan power header and the other one into the 5-volt RGB header. You're looking for sys fan or chassis fan headers, and then 3-pin 5-volt RGB headers, which we name different things on different motherboards. But you can see here, we're looking at sys fan, for example, sys fan 4, sys fan 5, and then ARGB header, the V2 one with the 3 pins in it. So from this view, you can see we can just plug the fan power connector into there, and that'll allow the motherboard to control the fan speed of it. Notice it's got a little plastic clip on the edge, so you need to make sure that's pushed in so all 4 pins are inserted properly. And then the 5-volt RGB connector, which is definitely more fiddly. I always had this being very fiddly in all the builds. Basically insert that into that 5-volt connector there and make sure the pins are properly lined up with the holes, and then tidy those cables up as much as you like. Next, we're on to HD audio and the front panel connectors, which are bundled in the Velcro ties at the side there. So you're just going to slip those through to the front as well. What you're looking for here is 2 connectors that look like this: F panel, HD audio. Notice both of them have 1 pin missing on them, so there's 1 hole that's missing. And you're looking to plug the F panel in on the right hand side of your motherboard, HD audio on the left. You should find on most motherboards there's the same sort of logic, and the connectors will work in the same way. So F panel goes on the bottom right hand side. Now on this motherboard there's a long connector down there. Generally speaking, you should find it's pretty straightforward. You just have to line up the connector with the pins on the motherboard. Now if you're not too sure about this, refer to your motherboard manual, because it will show you the markings of where this plugs in, but it will invariably be the bottom right corner there. HD audio is the opposite side of the motherboard. You're looking for F audio or HD audio, and this connector will also only plug in one way round. So just pop that in place there and then tidy those cables up. Next up, we've got a USB connection. So this is those 4 USB-C connectors on the top of the case. They are USB 3 and USB 3.2 connectors in the cabling though, so we need to make sure we've got enough length here. So remove those from the Velcro ties so that we can run them through to the front and connect those up to the motherboard. This will vary slightly from motherboard to motherboard, but usually this cable, the smaller of the 2, is the USB-C cable, which will run close to the 24-pin power connector on the motherboard, which is on the top right of the motherboard. And the other one, the larger connector, is usually somewhere nearby as well. You'll see on this motherboard, USB 3.2 is just below the 24-pin power connector, and it has a little plastic cap on it as standard. It also will only plug in one way round in the port, so you need to make sure that when you go to connect it up, you hear it click. If it doesn't click, then it's probably the wrong way around. You need to turn it around and plug it in the other way. Now, the USB 3.0 connector on this motherboard is actually down below the SATA ports near the F panel connector, as you can see here. This is actually pretty unusual. Most motherboards usually have it in a different position, closer to the 24-pin power connector, as you can see here, USB 3.2 markings on this motherboard, and you'll see where that would plug in at the top there. So slightly different, worth bearing in mind. But on this motherboard, it slots in down here. It has a little plastic clip on part of it, so you can only actually put it in there one way round, and you just need to make sure that's fully seated and pushed into place, and then tidy those cables up by running them through the bristles on the side here and making that nice and neat. Now for the next stage, I'd recommend setting up your power supply unit. In this instance, I'm using Lee's RS 1200G rotational shift power supply unit. I'm going to show you all the cables that you need in order to connect up your motherboard and get that set up properly, starting with the 24-pin power connector and the 2 CPU power connectors. I've got a separate guide on this power supply unit and others, and so it might be worth checking those out if you'd like to find out more. But basically what we're looking to do here is to plug the cables in. So I'm going to show you where they connect up, how to plug them in outside the build so it's really clear, and then I'll show you how to plug them in once it's built as well. So with this rotational power supply unit, you have a choice of 24-pin power connectors can go on either side of the power supply unit, with the majority of the other cables plugging in on the edge. Most modular power supply units will have all the cables on one side, and you just need to plug in the cables that you're actually going to be using. So with the 2 parts plugged into the power supply unit, the other part of the cable needs to plug into the 24-pin power connector on the right-hand side of the motherboard. This cable will only plug in one way round, which is a theme for a lot of these things, but it has a little plastic clip on it, so push that into place. You should feel it notch into place there and click, so it can't be removed. We then have cable combs included with this power supply unit that allow you to put additional combs onto the cable so you can keep things nice and neat. It's a little bit fiddly, but you can run each of the individual cables into the combs here and then basically go about tidying things up. This allows you to run the comb along the cable, neaten those cables, and keep them all in line so they're very tidy. There's a little cover that goes on the other side of it once you've worked your cables through the combs. And then once the cable's installed into the system, you can see that you can use that to adjust the cables, neaten things up, and keep that cable looking good. We then have 2 CPU power connectors, which are marked PSU on one end and CPU on the other end. PSU end plugs into the power supply unit. The CPU end plugs into the motherboard, so watch out for that. We're looking for the CPU ports on the power supply unit, so you can see those in the bottom left of this. And we need to plug the PSU end into there and then run the cables through the case and plug them in at the top left of the motherboard. So 2 cables for this. If you have 2 connectors on your motherboard, I'd recommend using the 2 cables. Some motherboards might have less. You might have 1, or you might have 1 8-pin and 1 4-pin. More on that in a second. But these cables essentially run through the case and then plug in at the top left. Again, I'm showing you this so you can see it really clearly outside of the build. Don't copy it now. What you want to do is wait until it's plugged in, but I want you to be able to see how these slot into place, how they click into the port, and how that little clip goes over the plastic notch along the edge of the socket. Now you might have a motherboard which only requires 1 of these or 1 4-pin. As you can see, this requires 1 8-pin and 1 4-pin, for example. If you have that in your system, you'll see that these CPU cables can actually be slid apart. So one of the connectors can slide apart, and then you've just got 1 4-pin connector that you can use on your motherboard, and then the other one can just be put somewhere in your system without having to worry about it. So that's how you'd power that. Now for graphics card powering, this is going to vary depending on the GPU you're using, whether you're using NVIDIA or AMD. You have 4 8-pin PCIe power cables included in the box, but we also have a 12-volt 2x6 connector as well. So I'll show you that in a second. But start with wiring GPUs like older NVIDIA graphics cards like this 3090, Intel GPUs or AMD GPUs. You'll usually find you have 8-pin connectors on them. So these PCIe power connectors, they plug into the row marked PCIe down here. So the PSU end plugs into that. So for this 3090, I just need 2 of these connectors. You might find you need 2 or 3 of these connectors on your graphics card. It's usually somewhere around that number. So you want to plug those into the power supply, and then we're going to plug them into the GPU for demonstration purposes outside of the case, but in a little while inside the build. So in order to do this, you want to pinch those 2 cables together to push them into the socket. Make sure they're both held in place nicely as they're pushed in, and the little plastic clip hooks over the little notch on the socket itself, so it's fully clicked into place there and held down. That will ensure that the GPU is properly powered in the system and that it then runs as it should. Now you might have a bigger GPU or one that requires 3 connectors like this 9070 XT or something similar. You'll see this has 3 8-pin PCIe power connectors. That's not a problem because this power supply has that many, and as long as you've got a decent wattage power supply unit, you should find that you have multiple cables in there. So we've actually got 2 additional PCIe power connectors. One of these is a pigtail one that has 2 connectors on one end and then one at the power supply end. I'd actually recommend not using this if you can help it and save the other ones instead for your 3-pin. Now, if you have a 12-volt 2x6 power connector, like on a 50 series graphics card or on a 40 series graphics card from NVIDIA, then this is the 12-volt 2x6 connector, which is 600 watt capable. Now, you use this in place of the adapter that invariably came with your GPU. It plugs in on one end to the power supply unit in this special port there, and you see it has blue pins on it. That's because you need to make sure it's fully inserted because it's quite a power hungry cable. So plug it into the power supply. The other end would plug into the graphics card, and you need to make sure in both instances that it's fully inserted into the socket so that you can't see those pins when you push it in. Fairly straightforward though, and it is nice and neat. And much like the 24-pin power connector, this cable comes with an additional cable comb. So it already has one pre-installed, but you can add in this additional one if you want to. Again, it's pretty fiddly to do. Each cable needs to be individually thread into the teeth of the combs in the right sort of order. So if you copy the one that's already on there, you can see how you can do it. And you just basically need to carry on this process. I've shortened this because it took me ages to do. But once you do it, it then allows you to neaten things up at the front a lot more, putting a clip over the back of it to hold it all in place once you're done. And then you'll be able to tidy the cables up and run the combs back and forth on there so that you can neaten those cables and make everything look nice and neat at the front, which is obviously important because you want a nice clean case. The good news is this is a nice long cable, so there's no problem in terms of tension on the GPU, and that runs through from the side, plugs in, and then it can be tidied up. Now, I'll show you how to install the GPU and the wiring of this again later on, but I just wanted to demonstrate how that would plug in. If you're planning on using SSDs and hard disk drives in your build, I'll show you the cabling for that as well. If not, you can use the timestamps to skip forward, but essentially these are SATA connectors, which on one end plugs into the SATA peripheral port on the power supply unit, and then you have multiple different connectors on the cable that you can use. There are actually different types of these cables included in the box, so it's worth thinking about where you're going to put these in the system and how far the cable's going to stretch and what you're going to need it for. But essentially, the power supply end plugs into the peripheral port, as you can see here, which is different to the others. And then the other end plugs into your drive. So on this crucial SSD, for example, you'll see we have this L-shaped connector for the power connector there. You just plug the cable into that port. Now, with these cables, you have multiple connectors on them, so you can plug in multiple drives. So you could put more than one on one cable. Then we have data cables, which you should find included with your motherboard, that run from each of the drives and plug into the SATA ports on the motherboard, which are invariably in the bottom right of the motherboard, as you can see there. So that's all that logic there. Once you've worked out what cables you need for your system, I'd recommend plugging them into the power supply unit before you go about installing it into the case. This will make life easier because you then won't need to fiddle about with cables once it's in the build and try and work out where cables should be plugged in. And then you can also go about tidying those cables up so that you can sort things out and neaten them up. So in this case, the power supply unit installs like this with the fan facing towards the back because it will then pull cold air in through the venting at the rear. We then use the 4 hexagonal screws included with the power supply to mount these to the back of the case, securing into the 4 holes there. And then you have all the cables to deal with and tidy up. So with the 24-pin power connector, as I showed you, that runs through the side here. So if you push it through the little hole on the cable tidying tray there, and then run it behind the airflow panel for the rear part that you're going to see here, and then push it through there and run it through to the front. Now, obviously, we need to make sure we end up with the plastic clip on the outside edge as we push it into the socket and notch it into place there so it's secured down there. And then use the cable combs to run those around and neaten things up so that those cables can be tidied and the majority of it can be hidden at the rear. What you want to do here is obviously end up with a clean looking build at the front, and you can make the most of the cable combs. But we also have plastic cable ties that you can use at the rear to neaten those cables up a little bit as well. So with the plastic cable ties that are included, you can tie the cables together at the back. I also tied the 24-pin power cable to the other cables that are on the cable hiding tray, so it's sort of clipped into place. If you do this in an intelligent way, you can make sure it's at the right angle as well, so the cables come from a certain angle and are neatened up at the rear here. You can also make use of other Velcro ties. So there's a tray at the top of a case that you can see we're looking down into now. You can use those to then tie the 24-pin power cable up to the top as well. That will also neaten it up. So we're just trying to hide away a lot of the bulk of this, but also angle it so that the front of it looks neat. Then we've got the two 8-pin CPU power connectors. So we run those through at the top here and then plug them in at the front. And there's a lot of cable here, as you can see. We don't really need all of that excess, but with some of it through the front now, we can plug those cables in. As I showed you earlier on, make sure you plug both of these cables in. They'll plug in at the top left here. A little hook goes over the port, plugs in and seats down. And then we'll tidy up the rest of the cables at the rear. With the power supply I'm using here, it has these little magnetic clips included as standard with little hooks on them. You can run the two 8-pin CPU power cables through these. So I used one at the top on that little shelf to then tidy those cables up by hooking them over that. This is easier than trying to use the Velcro ties because of the angle it comes from. Another additional one of these can then be hooked in near the middle at the back of the case. You can secure two cables into it. You can actually fold these cables over and put a third layer in there as well. There's enough room to do that. And then we're basically looking to put it into somewhere in the case, which is obviously a metal place where you can seat that down, and then a slight magnetism there to hold that down. So I secured that with a couple of clips there, and you can end up neatening up your 8-pin power cables for the CPU socket by just tidying them out of the way. Now, to install SSDs and hard disk drives, you can remove this tray down the bottom here. If you're not planning on using these drives, you obviously could just remove this from the case entirely to give yourself more space for other things. But if you're going to be using them, I'll show you how to do it. If not, you can use the timestamps to skip ahead. So this little thing can hold two SSDs and one hard disk drive. SSDs mount to the inside of it like this so that you can see the connectors through the bottom. You then use the small screws that you can see me using here to secure that drive to the back of the plate like this, and you can obviously repeat this process so that two drives are installed onto this. Now on top of that, you can then mount a hard disk drive, so a traditional platter drive can be put in place here. You'd use the same screws that were used for securing the motherboard down in place earlier on. You need 4 of those. Essentially what you're trying to do is to line up the little metal plates on the side here with the screw holes on the side of the drive. Make sure you pay attention to the way I've done it, because you want the connectors to be off towards the left on the plate so that when you put it back into the case, you can easily plug those in. But you can see from this other angle how that looks. So you're just screwing that drive into place there, and then by the end it should look like this. So you can see you've got connectors on the end, and then the connectors for the SSDs are also visible through the back as well, so that you'll be able to plug in both the power and data cables for those drives really easily once it's reinstalled back in the case. So you reinsert it back into this case, secure it with the thumb screws at the rear there, tighten that back up, and then that's mounted there. We'll then want to plug the cables in. So as I showed you earlier on, the SATA power cable plugs into the SSD like that, and then because you can put multiple things on it, you can run another part of that cable, plug the connector into the hard disk drive as well. Then you've got the 2 data cables that plug into the drives, one for the hard disk drive, one for the SSD, and then run them through to the front too. So those 2 data cables will plug in at the bottom right hand side of the motherboard. So run them through to the front, going through the cable tray like this, and behind that airflow panel as well, and then push them through into the front of the case, and then slip them into the ports. This is a little bit fiddly behind the anti-sag bracket for the graphics card, but it is possible to do. Now, for installing the top fans, so these are the exhaust fans on the case, you'll first probably want to remove the tray. There's a little screw holding it in place at the top. Unscrew that, and then you can remove that tray from there. This makes life a little bit easier. I'm using RS120 AIGB fans, which are similar to the ones mounted on the bottom of the case that come pre-installed. These are ARGB fans that daisy chain together, and then, as we did earlier on, have 2 connectors on them. What you need to do is to make sure that they're facing blade down into the case, so downwards with the backs facing upwards like this. So we need to line that up and then make sure that the tray would fit on top of those in a logical way. You'll also want to make sure that your cables face towards the rear of the build. It's important to bear that in mind. Now, in order to connect these up, the most logical thing to do is to start with the extension leads that come in their box. You want to plug the male connector, the fan power connector, into the female connector of that extension lead. And then what you want to do is then plug in the male connector from the extension lead for the RGB connector into the female 5-volt RGB connector on the fan. With this logic in mind, you can then connect each of the other fans together, and then the connectors on the extension leads will be correct for plugging into the motherboard. So we will then move on to the next fan. So from that original fan, you can see we've got the extension leads plugged into that. And then from there, obviously the next connector is male connector for the RGB connection from the fan on the right to the female connector from the fan in the middle of the chain, and then the fan power connector with female connector from the one on the right to the male connector in the one in the middle. And that way both RGB and fan power are passing through each of those fans, and then repeat that process again. Male connector from the middle fan to the female connector on the left fan, and then female fan power connector from the middle fan to the male fan connector on that other one, and then turn the fans round. Imagine, if you will, this is what it's going to look like in the case with the fans facing towards the back. Line up the tray properly so that it is as it would have come out of the case. So make sure that the little clips, for example, are on the left-hand side and the screw hole for it on the right. Use the fan screws that came with the fans to secure those fans to that tray, screwing 4 screws per fan into these to secure it down so that it looks like this. And then what you should find is you've got these fans that you can insert into the case, obviously with some cables that you're going to need to manage as you do so. Start by passing the extension leads for these fans through the rear here, pushing that into the hole at the top so that we can then tidy those cables up and also plug them in a little while. And then we're going to see that tray back in place. Note that the cables on the edge are a little bit fiddly, but you do want to make sure they're this way round so you don't see them from the front of the case. Insert that tray into there, and then obviously you're going to want to re-secure that tray with the little screw that came out of it initially, putting that back in place there. Now for those cables, I'd recommend using some plastic cable ties. You can tidy these cables up like this, so the fan power and the RGB cable that came with the RS fans, essentially just trying to tidy those up a little bit so they don't get in the way and don't end up making a mess at the back of the case. But the idea here is we're going to run these cables and plug them into the motherboard. Now you can either plug them directly into the motherboard connections as I showed earlier on, with the same sort of logic as the fans at the bottom of the case, 5-volt RGB header and system fan power connector, or you take the 5-volt RGB connector, this female one, and connect it up with the male connector from the bottom chain of fans. So there's 3 fans at the bottom. Take the little plastic cap off of that, which is difficult to show on video because it's nestled away at the bottom there, and then connect those 2 together. That way all 6 fans RGB is then connected up, and then that is connected to the motherboard already with just 1 connector. And then you just need to plug the system fan power connector for the top 3 fans into the motherboard. I wouldn't recommend chaining the power for all 6 fans together, but the RGB should be just fine. You have limited amount of RGB connectors probably on your motherboard, so that will help. Now the airflow panel at the rear can be removed. There's a thumb screw at the bottom to basically loosen it. Then you lift it up slightly and then you can take it out. This is handy because it'll make it easier to install your all-in-one cooler. You can see at the top it's got those bristles where we can run the pump tubes through later on so you can keep things nice and neat. Remember the angle that this came out of because it's obviously designed with a slight curve on it. I'm using a Nautilus all-in-one cooler for this. Now you can use the standard fans if you'd like, but I'm going to swap them out for the RS fans because I want the RGB to match with the other fans in the system. You could use the standard fans on the radiator. What you'd want to do is mount them to the side that doesn't have the tubes on it. So the other side's the ones I'm putting on now. I'll show you in a second how that would work. What I'm doing here is putting 3 fans on this side first of all, and mounting them with the blades facing the radiator. The idea here is to pull air through the radiator and exhaust it out of the back. And so you use the long radiator screws to go through there. Now note how I've got the cables for these. It's important to pay attention to the cabling of this and not make a mistake with it. What we're doing here is running the cables for the fans along the edge here so that they'll be at the back of the case, but easy enough to access to be able to plug things in. Repeat the same sort of logic that I showed you for the other RS fans in the system so that you end up with the female connectors on the extension leads. Now, with the front fans, you want to put them so they're facing with the fan blades facing outwards. Notice here that I've made a cabling error because I've put the fan cables basically on the opposite side from each other. You don't want to do this because it'll end up being messy and problematic in a minute. So with the standard logic, what you would do is you remove this front radiator tray from the case. So this has 2 screws on it at the top that you'd unscrew, and then you can take that tray out. The idea here is then that you would put the radiator onto it by mounting with the long screws through this tray into the fans and then into the radiator to hold it in place. So that would be the basic setup, and this is roughly how that would look if you were installing it with just the 3 standard fans. But you do need to pay attention to a couple of things. As I said, make sure the cables are facing the right way, and also that the tray is facing the right way, because I actually installed it the wrong way around first of all. You want to make sure that the tubes on the radiator are at the opposite end to the little notches on the bottom of the tray, and also that you haven't done what I've done, which is end up with cables on different sides. So I had to then undo the fans and flip them over so that the cables ended up basically being on the same side, because otherwise you could have cables visible both sides of the radiator and it will make wiring of this pretty difficult to do and messy. But the goal is to end up with fans pulling air through the front of the case, through the radiator, and then other fans on the other side pulling the air through and exhausting it out of the rear, blowing past that airflow panel in the case. As you can see, it's a little bit fiddly to do. Also ignore how I've got really long cables on these RS fans because they were the original RS fans that were sent before launch. You should find you have shorter, neater fan cables there. But we're lining up the tray with the fans so that we can then put the screws through the holes. And it's a little bit fiddly to do, as you can imagine, because you've got to get through the tray, through the fan holes and into the radiator holes. You have to line all of those up neatly and then screw them all in individually. And obviously it's 4 screws per fan. But luckily all of these screws are included with the cooler, so we actually have enough to do this push-pull setup without any problems, and that is standard, but obviously additional fans are additional purchase. Then once that's done, we want to run the tubes and the cooler for the radiator through to the front, pushing that gently through there, keeping that plastic cap in place so you don't damage the thermal paste while doing so. Then you want to seat the radiator tray so that the little notches on it notch back into the bottom of the case. You also have to try and manage the cables at this point as well, which I also found a little bit of a problem with. You'll notice the fan cables on the front, for example, are kind of getting in the way of that pillar on the front of the case, and it won't be easy to get those through. I only really realized this as I was doing it, but what I discovered is it's possible to run those cables up to the top and over the top of the radiator tray and then still get them through the gap at the top there. So if you have the same issue, you can do that and then it shouldn't be a problem. Now obviously with push-pull radiator, we've got a lot more fan cables on here, so it does look a little bit messier, and we'll have to sort that out and tidy it up in a moment. In a little while, you're going to see why I also said about how this is going to present a problem for putting the glass panel back on, and I'll show you more on that in a moment. But at this stage, we can tidy this up and tighten up those screws that hold the radiator tray back in place. And that's the setup for this. Now, this is actually possible, as I've shown, to put a push-pull setup on here. There is room just about. And I will say just about because it is a little bit tricky in terms of the fit for getting the airflow panel back on. So I found that this was quite difficult to get back in. Make sure it's the same way it came out and angled in properly. What we want to do is run it basically past the fans on there and then push it through and hook it back in at the front. I found I had to adjust the position of the radiator a couple of times, moving it up and down so that I could do this. I also found that I couldn't screw it in again to the bottom of the case because of the way it sits, but it is possible to fit it back in there and still have it blocked so that the air from the radiator isn't flowing into the front of the case, and that way you can keep that triple chamber set up so that it works properly and the airflow isn't interfered with. And you can see we can then sort that out so it looks pretty good at the back, and most of the cable shame's hidden back there as well. With that sorted out, we can then mount the pump itself to the CPU block. So now remove the plastic housing around that protects the copper plate and the thermal paste. Now it comes with an Intel bracket as standard on the cooler, so you need to remove that first of all. We need to basically push that out to remove it from the edge there, and then replace it with the AMD one that was included in the box of the cooler. You'll find that it's this one here that slots in like this. Notice how the tubes are on one side, the bracket slips in over the top on the opposite side to that. This also shows you how you install the pump block. You either have the option of putting the tubes on the right hand side or on the left hand side of the socket. We're looking to line up that bracket with the standoffs that we put in place earlier on. I decided that the tubes on the left would be better because they'll then not be blocking the RAM and it should be a little bit neater. The downside to this is the USB cable coming out of the screen will then be blocking the RAM a little bit. But this is a solution to try and make it look kind of neat in that the tubes are hidden mostly and the radiator is obviously at the back. Slip that down over the top and then use the thumb screws that come with the cooler to basically screw into the standoffs that we put on earlier on. So we're going to secure all four of those. I'd recommend doing it by hand to start with and then tighten them with a screwdriver as you go through, and basically just go one at a time on each of these, ideally going corner to corner or opposite side to opposite side, and basically try and tighten those up. If you find if you tighten one up too much on one side, it will lift on the other, so it's a little bit tricky to do. But use a screwdriver to finish it off, just to make sure those are tightened properly. Don't force it, but just screw it until they won't go any further, and then that's secured. Then what I need to do is run the USB cable to the rear because it's going to plug in the bottom middle of the motherboard. So run it up to the top there. As you can see, there's an excess of it. We want to try and hide that away and put it towards the back, and we'll sort that out in a second. The other cable that's coming out of the pump itself can connect up to a couple of different things depending on your motherboard setup. So usually you'd plug this into the AIO pump header, which on this motherboard is down the bottom for some reason. It's the pump header down here, AIO pump, or in this case, fan 6 pump or fan 5 pump. And you can see that there. You might alternatively want to use a CPU fan, but I'm actually saving CPU fan for the fans themselves on the radiator. I'm going to use CPU fan and CPU optional for both sets of fan power. Now on some motherboards like this one, for example, you'll find that the AIO pump header is actually at the top. So you can see AIO pump is up with CPU fan and CPU optional. So you'd plug the pump in up there instead as an alternative. And that's much easier to do because you can just plug it directly into that. So if you want to do that, that's not a problem. It's quite a short cable and it stands out being black, unfortunately. But you'd plug that into the CPU fan if you wanted to, or AIO pump if you have access. But on this motherboard, what I decided to do is tidy the cable up by hiding it under one of the heat sinks for the NVMe's that I'm not using down the bottom here. Run the cable through the gaps down there and then plug it into the pump header at the bottom of there, and then hide it away again by putting the heat shields back over the top. So it's not as visible and hopefully looks neat, especially once the graphics card's in place. You'll barely be able to see that run down there. Then the USB cable needs to run through the back of the case and run down towards the bottom middle of the motherboard. So this is essential if you've got a cooler with a screen on it like this one, because I'm going to use this so that IQ can recognize it, so we can control it with Corsair's IQ software, as I'll show you later on. So that plugs into the USB header in the bottom middle of the motherboard. You should find you've usually got one or two of these that you can easily access down there. The cable will only plug in one way, a bit like the F panel and HD audio headers. It has a pin missing, so you can only plug it one way around. Now for the RGB lighting for the 6 fans on the radiator, I actually chain in those together. So the 5-volt RGB connector, the male and female connector on either side, basically put those together. And then you end up with 3 cables. So 2 fan power for 2 sets of fans, and then 1 5-volt RGB connector. So all 6 fans are just used 3 connectors that they need to plug into the motherboard. So that way I've daisy chained the RGB connectors on those, much like I did on the top and bottom fans. For the fan power connectors, they'll then plug into CPU fan and CPU optional. So both sets of fans are powered by the motherboard. You should find these connectors at the top of the motherboard on the top right here. Fairly easy. And then we've got the 5-volt ARGB header on the right hand side as well, so that everything can be connected up there. You'll then be able to control it with your BIOS and with your motherboard's RGB software, as I'll show you in a little while. So in this instance, it would be RGB Fusion and Gigabyte Control Center, and the fan speed can be controlled by the BIOS quite easily as well. And that's the wiring of the fans. But as you can see, a lot of mess at the back with those fan cables, especially with the older RS fans, a little bit messy. But what you want to do here is to use the Velcro ties to try and tidy things up as much as you can. And then plastic cable ties can be used to tie the cables together. So I tied the cables together at the top a little bit, so they're a lot neater now, and then wrap those into the Velcro ties. And then I also used plastic cable ties to hook the cables into various places in the case as well. So there are holes that you'll be able to find in the case where you can tie them in. So I managed to do it here on the bottom left of the case, for example. So the cables are kind of closer to the radiator, so it looks a little neater. And then the front view just did a quick test to make sure everything was working properly. As you can see, all the fans are powered up and lighting up, as well as the display as well. And now we're going to go on to the graphics card installation and the setup of that. So I'm going to talk you through how to connect that up and the wiring again. So this is a 2-slot GPU. First of all, you need to remove 2 of the PCIe brackets, the 2 here just below that very top one, unscrew those and then remove them. And then we're going to seat the GPU in place. So that needs to slot into that top PCIe X16 slot there. So you just got to line it up with that. Now you have to get the silver pins sort of between the motherboard and the case at the back, as you can see on the edge of the graphics card. Line that up with the slot and with those parts there, and then you should be able to just push it in until you find it clicks into place. Then use the screws that we took out of the PCIe brackets to secure the GPU at the other end, screwing it back down into there so it's nice and tightened up there, and that will help keep it in place there. We have that sorted out, and then you can also use the anti-sag bracket that's included with this case. So if you unscrew that from the bottom, you can slide it up into position. They include this little rubber mount with some sticky pad on it, which I'd recommend using because you can put it on the back of the anti-sag bracket, and then you can slide the anti-sag bracket up the case so that then pushes up against the bottom of the GPU. You've got to take care here that essentially this bracket doesn't touch the fan, because you don't want to block it from being able to spin, and that can happen if you're not careful. So just run that up there, push it into the bottom, make sure it's not touching the fan, and then tighten that top part so it's secured. Then you've got to run your power cables through from the front. So I'm using the 12-volt 2x6 cable as I showed earlier. First of all, tidying the cables up a little bit using those cable combs so we can adjust them so they're nice and neat, so only the neat part is visible. And then I'm going to thread it through. And I found the easiest way to do this was to go in from the side. So basically running it through the cable hiding tray, past the airflow bracket, somewhere at the bottom middle of the case, so that a minimal amount of the cables are visible through the front. And also just so that there's not loads of pressure onto the cable as well, because you don't want loads of torsion on there. You don't want it being pulled in a certain direction. Basically going to plug that in now and then adjust the cable so it's nice and neat at the front and isn't putting unnecessary pressure on the socket, because you want to make sure that basically that this cable is working properly. It's a 600-watt cable, so a lot of power could pass through it potentially. You don't want it melting, and in order to do that, you make sure it's fully seated. And then we can put everything back together. So with the standard left glass door panel, obviously that hooks back into those pins I showed you at the beginning, and then screw it back in with that little screw to make sure it's secured properly there as well. The rear door also does the same logic on the opposite side. So basically it goes back over those pins, and screws back in as well. So that's fairly straightforward in order to be able to do that. The problem came for me when I went to try to re-secure the other glass panel, which is why I suggested not taking it off in the beginning. I realized in order to do this, I was going to have to remove the radiator tray, because if you look, when you try and put the door back on, obviously the bits go through there and you've got to try and put the pins back in place. You also have to put the bracket back in place, which means you need to be able to reach round from the right side, put the bracket back in place there, put the pin back in place there, screw those brackets back into place. It is very fiddly in order to do this, unfortunately. I found it very tricky to do. So you can see now that I've got the plate in place, I've got the pins back in, I've then tried to put the screws back into that. And in order to do that, I had to remove the radiator tray first. It was very fiddly to be able to do that. But then eventually you get to a stage where you can then reseat the radiator tray and screw it back in. But that's just why I said maybe consider not taking that glass panel off. Just be careful during the build process, because it was definitely the fiddliest bit. And then you can put that front panel back on. Now, it's worth noting the dust filter that was included in the accessories box can be put between that and your fans if you want extra blockage for dust ingress. But it is said to reduce the cooling potential of the system by a few degrees if you do that, but it will stop dust getting in. Then there's plastic to be peeled off the inside of the glass panels before you then close the doors back on that and shut those. So just do that, then you have a clear view inside the case and you'll be able to see properly what it looks like. So hopefully you've seen now some helpful tips on how to build a pretty good looking PC. I'm going to do a full review of this case in the near future, so subscribe to see that if you're not subscribed already. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I actually found this performs very well. That push-pull radiator setup obviously means all the hot air is being blown out the back thanks to the airflow panel around there. And then you've got intake fans on the bottom blowing directly on the graphics card and other things, and exhaust at the top. It's very straightforward to build in for the most part, pretty easy to do, and you end up with a really nice looking PC by the end as well. Very pleased with how this came out, although the cables are a little bit visible at the back, but let's be honest, you're probably not looking at the back very often anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And this setup here actually runs quite nicely as well. I'd recommend going into the BIOS and setting the fans to PWM mode on the relevant headers. I've got a separate guide on that if you need it. Now, in terms of the RGB control, I'm using Gigabyte Control Center here and RGB Fusion. From that, you can then select a number of different RGB presets. With the fans connected directly to the motherboard with the 5-volt RGB header, this will allow you to go through various different colors and effects on there, and that's how I got the RGB to sync across all of those fans. And you should find with other motherboards, you've got similar software, so MSI Mystic Light, Zeus's Aurora Sync, for example. With the Nautilus LCD and the Dominator RAM that I've used in this, you obviously can control the RGB lighting in Corsair's IQ software. But if you go into the software settings on that as well, and then the plugin section, in there you'll find there's a Gigabyte plugin. Install the Gigabyte plugin, and then you'll find that once you restart it, you can then control the RGB lighting of the motherboard. So you can see the motherboard's now available in there, and we can select different effects for the RGB headers. Now, this will now affect the Corsair things in the case, so the RGB RAM, for example, but also the fans that are connected to the motherboard, which usually wouldn't be controllable with IQ because they're connected directly to the motherboard rather than an IQ controller. But you can see we can adjust all of the lighting now easily using Corsair's various different presets. Now, how this works varies. You see some of them are a bit too aggressive. It's not a perfect system, I don't think, but it does mean that you can tie the two things together. So Gigabyte and Corsair work quite nicely together here, and you can get it so more of the things sort of line up in terms of the RGB lighting and the effects there as well, which is pretty cool. In terms of the display, from the Nautilus software within IQ, you can adjust the various different settings of the display and choose what's shown on there. There are a lot of different options here in terms of the screen, what you can show in terms of temperatures of the CPU and GPU temperature or whatever else you want to display in there. You can choose different images, you can choose different effects, you can have GIFs on there as you've seen. I've already had those things on there as well. And you get an idea of what those look like. So you can see we can set those. You can also adjust the color of the text. So you can change the color of the text. You can choose what sensor you're doing. You can change the background of those images as well, so you can adjust a lot of different things in here. You do need to make sure, obviously, the USB connection is in place for this to work properly. So if the screen isn't working for some reason, it could be that. You might also find there are firmware updates available via Corsair's IQ software that you can use to apply to this as well. And then you'll find that set up nicely. If you want to, you can also set up a device memory mode, which is essentially what the screen will do when IQ isn't running. So if you want it not running at some point, or if you want to set a screen to come on when you just turn your PC on before it gets into Windows, you can choose which of these displays it will show as standard and then just save that. So hopefully I've given you some helpful tips on how to get this case set up and get it looking nice. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. Check out the links in the description to more related content and other things you need to know, useful videos and more. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks very much for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.